Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today on today's Net Zero Week webinar on a step-by-step guide to SME net zero transition planning. It's fantastic to see that there are so many of you have signed up to today's webinar, and we're very excited about the webinar that we've got in store for you today. We've got a great panel lined up to take you through this very practical session that we've planned. And before we start, I just briefly wanted to explain a little bit about the Net Zero Flex, why we're holding this webinar, and then I'll do some housekeeping. But first of all, as you probably know, the Flex is on net zero transition planning for SMEs. Is a free online standard, and the current version, launched at the end of 2024, was created as a code of practice, and it was conceived as a guide to help small and medium-sized enterprises start planning a net zero transition. So it's developed because, as we all know, net zero is obviously the defining socio-economic issue really of our time, and touches every sector, business and life on the planet. So larger businesses were expected to report progress, or they are expected to report progress on net zero and their emissions targets. And the UK's Transition Plan Task Force created a great framework for those larger organisations organised who are obligated to report. However, research found that that those that are not currently in that reporting compliance framework really needed some support. So the SMEs amongst the economy. So the Flex was then designed to sort of help support business making transition planning consistent and scalable. To ensure the Flex was as useful as possible, we commissioned some case studies with some different companies, including a jewellers, an eco travel company, accountants, to find out their perspectives on the standard. And those were written up into studies that you can find from the website or from our Net Zero Standards Hub. As part of the efforts to check on the effectiveness of standards, BSI undertook an impact assessment study on the standard itself, and it was led by my colleague Demi Georgiou, who also undertook some case studies on with some of the SMEs that she interviewed. And you're going to hear a little bit more from Demi very shortly about the results and recommendations to improve support for undertaking net zero planning for SMEs that we got from that research, and about the Flex itself and how we could really use that. So with that in mind, we'll turn to today's session, where we'll dig into the impact assessment recommendations and the practical ways that the panelists would advise addressing key areas around these for planning in your organisations. So first of all, quickly, some housekeeping. Thanks very much. So this is a listen-only webinar. Microphones and cameras stay off for attendees, but please submit questions using the question button at the top right of the screen. And questions will be addressed following the presentations, and we'll have a panel discussion after that. Monitor the chat in the top right for any information that we might provide you, such as links to anything that's mentioned throughout the webinar. And there will be, once you've completed your feedback survey, we'll provide a link to the recording that we'll be doing of the webinar today. And to learn about more of the upcoming news, etc., please do this upcoming events, including in Net Zero Week. There's a QR code just there that hopefully you'll have had a chance to point at while we're here on the screen. Anyway, thank you very much for that. And so to the agenda, the session is going to take about an hour and a half. We're going to start with theme setting from Demi, and then who is our evaluation impact manager, and she's going to look at the impact assessment study and key recommendations. And from there, we're going to move to our two panelists who are from the advisory group, the original advisory group, who were involved in developing the Flex itself. So so that's Sam Jackson, who's Director of Climate Science and Impacted Ecology. He's going to show you how to make the case for net zero planning really clearly within your organisation. And Mike Jones, who's Carbon Management and Sustainability Manager for 5D Net Zero, who's going to dig into the resources available to help you with all of that. So throughout all the practical discussion, the panelists will be considering the wider question of how to implement the practices that are really going to impact on net zero and GHG reduction. Please ask the questions as we've said throughout the webinar, and we'll leave plenty of time to ask those Mike and Sam questions about net zero planning, or of course you can also ask Demi at the end about the impact assessment study if you're interested in that research and what it showed. Over to you now, Debbie. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah. Hi everyone, I'm Demi Georgiou, and as Sarah said, I'm an Evaluation and Impact Assessment Manager in our Research Intelligence team at BSI. Before I jump into the findings, on my first slide, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about background. So as Sarah mentioned, the Flex 3030 is guidance for SMEs on net zero transition plans. And we had 3 core goals. The first one is providing guidance, particularly for SMEs in developing that long-term plan. The second one was to establish a framework to support SMEs in actually implementing that plan and also demonstrating that transition to net zero. And then thirdly, signposting additional resources and tools. In early 2025, which was around a year after the first publication of the Flex, we undertook some research and impact assessment so we could assess how organisations are engaging, perceiving, and also if they're experiencing any impacts of using the Flex 3030. We had 138 completed surveys with downloaders and 5 in-depth interviews so that we could gain some deeper insight as well. I also wanted to say a quick thank you to anybody on here who may have taken part in that research. It was really valuable for us, and I also hope valuable for you in today's session. So onto my next slide, here are some of our key findings from the research that we did. So starting right at the top, 75% of the organisations that we spoke to had read the BSI Flex 3030. So engagement with the standard was relatively strong, with most having at least skim-read it. Among those who didn't read it, the most common reason that they gave was a lack of time, not being able to get around to it yet. And people had heard of it mainly through us at BSI, so through a direct email from us or from our social media channels. Onto our second point, 82% of those who read it said that it was clear and it was useful. So most readers rated it really highly for that clarity and that utility. Many also said it effectively conveys its core messages. And what we mean by that is it's effectively giving the messages that we wanted it to give. So in particular, they felt that it was encouraging organisations to set long-term net zero goals. 64% of those who read it said they are using it or planning to use it. So many have already begun to use it, and among this group, around 2/3 have already started to develop and implement a net zero transition plan. Among our primary users, and by primary users, what I mean is those who are using the Flex in their own organisation. So as opposed, let's say, to a consultancy who is using it to support their clients. So among those primary users, many have actually already started to take some early steps, such as defining boundaries, setting a baseline, and we have 54% who have set a net zero target. We have fewer moving on to the implementation stages just yet. And now, finally, among those who have started making progress with it, they are already seeing a positive impact. So we have 88% of our users saying that it's accelerated their journey to net zero. We also have 6 in 10 who expect that it will reduce their GHG emissions within the next 5 years, and most also anticipate reputational benefits among their key stakeholders. So what you're seeing on this slide really is a story, starting from the beginning of reading the Flex, moving on to be able to understand it and take away its key messages, making that decision to use it, and then start taking those early steps of defining boundaries, and finally being able to realise some of the impact. And I think some of the real value of research is being able to see this story and share it with you. But on the flip side, I think there's also real value in thinking, okay, but what can we also learn? So on my next slide, I wanted to take you through some of the recommendations from the research that we did. So our first one is that the largest barriers that organisations are facing are typically competing organisational priorities and a misalignment with the systems that already exist in the organisation. From our survey and also our interviews, we also spoke about how vital support from leadership is. But some felt that there is somewhat of a gap between almost a theoretical commitment or saying that there is a commitment to net zero, but then actually making those day-to-day decisions that drive change. So the recommendation here It's about building a strong case for action. A case that embeds urgency and shows how net zero planning supports both long-term environmental goals, but also business resilience. The second finding is that among those who didn't read the flex, as I mentioned on the last slide, most commonly gave the reason of lack of time, not being able to get around to it yet. When we asked about challenges, we also found that limited internal capacity and expertise were common challenges that many faced. So the recommendation here is to think about how to get started with the resources that you do have and how to build expertise so that the guidance can be applied effectively. And finally, implementation was seen as the more challenging phase. And as mentioned, fewer organisations have made progress so far beyond those planning stages. When we spoke to our respondents and our interviewees, they were highlighting that tangible, practical examples could be something that helps them move forward with that journey and accelerates their progress. So the recommendation from the research here is about looking into real-world examples to support that move from planning to delivery, and also started to take some small actions to help build momentum, but also to build confidence. In a moment, Sam and Mike are going to take a deeper look in some of these recommendations. But just before that, there was a question that we wanted to ask you. So our question for you is, what barriers, and hopefully it will pop up on your screen in a moment, what barriers has your organisation faced in getting started on this net zero journey? Our response options are time, internal resources such as staff, funding, knowledge and expertise, so actually knowing where to begin or having access to advice, leadership and stakeholder support, so having that support from the leadership teams or buy-in from stakeholders, and organisational culture or competing priorities within the organisation. We'll just give you a few seconds to answer that, and I will pass over to Sam. Thank you.
Thanks, Demi. I'll give you a few more seconds to respond to the poll before I chime in. Wonderful. There's still some responses coming in, but I'm going to start commentating and then I'll come onto camera and start going through the case for net zero transition planning. What's really interesting from these results, I think, is the spread. There's a good number of results in here, and even the lowest response, leadership and stakeholder support, has got 14 of you so far responding. And so what's really interesting is how there's never just one thing for an SME as a blocker to getting started on a net zero journey, and that was what I wanted to focus on in talking to you in the kind of practical side of the presentation and of the workshop today, because very often there are barriers to implementation, which Mike is going to talk to a little bit later. But before we get to implementation, we have to find the time, we have to know what resources are at our disposal, we have to make sure our staff are aware and have the capabilities to do the net zero transition planning and have the direction that might come from the flex, and so on and so forth. And so there's sort of two separate challenges here, one to do with getting started, and two, when you've got started, how do you then implement and kind of go from there? I think the poll has just closed. Thank you so much to all of you that have responded on that one. There will be another poll on implementation a little bit later, but before we get there, I'll start to talk about making the case. Now, so some of you may have met me before. My name's Sam. I work for a company called Ecology. And what Ecology basically does is end-to-end climate services for primarily smaller businesses. So from measurement all the way through to science-based targets, reduction planning, and indeed funding of projects through market-based mechanisms like carbon credits, and also philanthropy as well. What Ecology is here to do is to help businesses like yours go through that journey. And what I wanted to talk about today then is the case for net zero transition planning. So given what we're here to talk about is a step-by-step approach, it's almost as though step zero, step one or step zero even, is to make the case, is to argue for this and get started going. And if I can just go on to the next slide, please. I wanted to tie that very closely with the recommendations from Demi's research, because recommendation 1 there was about building the strong case that embeds the urgency and demonstrates that transition planning it's not just an altruistic exercise. It's not just because it's the right thing to do, though of course it is. It's also going to be really critical to your long-term business success and your resilience, which as a small business is obviously mission critical, because so often small businesses or small and medium-sized businesses are just trying to keep the lights on, just trying to move forward and grow as a business and survive before they can thrive. And then of course use some real world examples to move from that planning to delivery. As such, on my agenda, I'm going to talk for about 10-15 minutes. I want to tackle those 2 recommendations through a few sort of sections that I put together. If I could have the next slide, there we go. Firstly, embedding urgency and understanding how this is important on a global scale, obviously, but important to the business as a whole. Climate change, net zero, the impacts of the climate change that we're already seeing are impacting your business and its bottom line already today. And so how do we kind of make that case to help stimulate that movement from 0 to 1? And then, as I say, a little bit later on, Mike's going to go, okay, let's go from 1 to 10. So the first 2 sections I've got are understanding the climate imperative and understanding the commercial imperative. And then I'm going to move into the barriers, the blockers. And obviously, those of you that responded to the poll earlier on, we had a really, really broad range, particularly in relation to resources, knowledge, skill sharing, that kind of thing. What do I need to do and how am I going to get going? And so I'll also give you a sneak peek into some research that we at Ecology have done on a similar vein with SMEs in the past, and see what kind of blockers resonate for you there. And then, of course, as I say, I'll go into a little bit of advice on how I think you can make the strongest case to kind of really embed transition planning into your business. Okay, so let's get started. So first and foremost is the kind of is why is this actually important? And again, when we were advising to the revision to the flex, it was one of those things that we kept coming back to is, I understand what's happening in the world, but why is it something that my business needs to really get involved in? And I would always try, I'm going to go into the economic argument shortly, but I would always try to start with the science. And so on my next slide, I've got the kind of, you will have seen this before, of course, the illustration from the IPCC, the chart from the IPCC, a time series of what's going on in the world, the observed warming that we're seeing and how we know that it's us. And I think the crucial thing here is that, albeit it's a very, very hot topic about how successful we're likely to be at meeting the 1.5 degree warming target from Paris, especially at the moment, given the UN General Assembly and the COP30 that's coming up, and New York Climate Week, which you might be aware of, which is happening this week. It's a very, very important topic of discussion, is where we are against 1.5. But critically, the climate imperative that impacts your business is the fact that the impacts of climate change between 1.5 and 2 degrees vary so enormously. And that means that, albeit there is some uncertainty in certain aspects of the science, there is no uncertainty as to whether this is happening, whether it's us, and whether our actions today will have an impact on it. And so we can be certain, insofar as certainty is possible, this is a thing that's happening. We are causing it. We have to change course. And crucially, that last piece at the bottom is most relevant for getting started on a transition plan, which is every fraction of every degree matters. And to that end, translating that into what it implies for a business, on my next slide, is the fact that the world is changing in these ways, the fact that our warming planet is influencing weather patterns, supply chains, all of these kinds of things mean that there is no escape for businesses that operate on this planet. No business exists in a vacuum, unfortunately. Everything is built upon the platform that nature provides us. And so whilst you are an SME, if you're trying to sell your product or your service or build tech or whatever it is that your SME does, your business cannot survive, it cannot thrive without supply chains, premises, staff, money, finance, insurance, access to markets. If you haven't got a solid brand reputation, you're not speaking to the consumers that you're trying to sell to, then unfortunately your business won't survive. And of course, as I say, all of these things are impacted by the climate that is changing around us. To use just to pull out a couple of examples, the physical risk associated with your premises or your supply chains. We've seen a number of times over the past sort of 3-4 years how extreme weather has affected, in particular, the food system. The quality of food, the availability of food, and things like this has been something that's incredibly visible for people. And that is exactly the sort of thing that ripples through a supply chain over the coming years. And so, if we're not thinking about these things, then our businesses are at a disadvantage. And I suppose that's the case I'm trying to make, as opposed to an academic case about what the impacts might be. This is really serious for any business, and especially a small business that's vulnerable to trying to keep the lights on through economic headwinds and all the rest. Can I get my next slide, please? Thank you. And to that end, we went and did some research on this as well. So it's in a similar vein to the research that Demi has done, that we talked through a little bit a minute ago, and the poll that we just put in front of you. Our hypothesis was this: it's really difficult to weigh up the imperative that I'm sure you're all aware of versus the imperatives of running an SME day to day. And so what we found, there's some stats that might be a little bit small on screen, but we found some similar stuff in our results. 57% of businesses are set to increase their investment in sustainability over the next 5 years. 72% of the businesses we surveyed have got some targets of some description, and that's increased by 9 percentage points year on year since we did our survey last year. 80% of businesses that we surveyed now agree that sustainability is a core part of their business strategy, and 85% believe that investing in sustainability delivers positive business results. And I guess the case that I want to make is that last one there is the one that's going to convince the stakeholders in your business and on your board to take the action that's going to stimulate a net zero transition plan aligned to the flex. And so what I put on the right there is, if we can embed net zero transition planning into the ordinary operation of business and the delivery of business success, then the kind of typical, slightly cliched understanding of yes, but this is going to cost us money, so we're not going to do it, becomes neutralized, because the two imperatives are harmonized rather than competitive. If we do this, we'll actually be set up better for success as a business. And that's kind of how I like to think and advise when we speak to our clients. You can convince the person very, very easily that climate change is something to be worried about and that it's going to affect the business. But if you can't then get that person to go back and make the decision that's going to cause this transition plan to start happening, those two things are really, really closely linked. And so we need to kind of get in the economic case as well. Next slide, please. And one of the key ways that I've seen that I think is really impactful for doing this and kind of bursting through that barrier of getting started is approaching it from a perspective of risks and opportunities. This is something that's becoming more and more of a critical tool in the toolbox for any sustainability professional or anybody who has had sustainability responsibilities thrust upon them in their business. All the things I've talked about thus far are risks, but on the flip side of every risk is an opportunity. So where we're thinking about if our supply chain is susceptible to disruption and shocks, then transition planning will help us bake resilience into that supply chain. If our staff are vulnerable to physical or well-being risk, then transition plan can help us protect and retain them, which is going to save us money. And then some more kind of immediate things. Insurance premiums will be higher if you don't have substantive ESG credentials, you're not working towards a transition plan. Your access to capital, and again, it comes back to money so often for small businesses. If you're looking to gain investment, you're going to need to do this. And whilst I would love to sit here, as a director of climate science and just talk about the climate, the physical science and the moral imperative, really we need to make the economic and commercial imperative clear for business owners to understand, and decision makers to understand, that the business will genuinely succeed more if we get started with a transition plan. And the final one on there I want to highlight is the brand leadership component. It's true, and I think we'll probably talk about regulation at some point a bit later in the session. It's true, I think, that the way the wind is blowing is for greater obligation on businesses of all types to report, disclose, and have transition plans. But also, prior to that legislative requirement, which I think will come through, or regulatory requirement, which will come through in the medium term, prior to that is the consumer demand. You will sell more to your customers if they think that you're acting in good faith and doing the things that are right by the planet. And so I think that's a critical one as well, because the brand leadership opportunity, I think, is enormous for small businesses to reach and really sing to their customers. Next slide, please. And again, what's really interesting about this is that, in my experience, speaking to thousands of businesses on a routine basis, is everyone can nod along to me and go, yeah, I completely agree. This is a really, really important thing. I can make the arguments. And yet I still can't convince internally our team to do anything. So what if you feel like you can't? Well, I want to explore just a little bit more some of those results from our survey. And again, this will echo with some of the things that we put in there in the poll at the start of the call. And I will skip implementation just a little bit because I know Mike's going to talk about resources and getting started in a moment. But a lot of the barriers that we do see are the same barriers that we can break down with the business case. So if you're a sustainability professional who is struggling to make the case to the decision committee in your business, or indeed if you're a business decision maker, a CEO for a small company or business owner, and you need to make the case to the board, the shareholders, whomever, I think it comes back to a lot of this. These barriers are addressable with the sorts of opportunities that I've talked about. We will be able to access capital. Our insurance premiums will go down. We will be able to train, retain, and protect our staff better. Those are the kind of arguments that make sense, I think. And I've gone even more hyperbolic on my next slide, which is to say, it's just to use the argument, as a business, we will make more money because that's what we're here to do. That's what, the CEO is accountable to the board to generate returns, to produce revenue, and we will make more money. We'll be a more successful business if we can implement a credible net zero transition plan than if we don't. And as I say, I always caveat that by saying it's not my favorite argument to make because I wish we'd all sit here and agree that this was the right thing to do anyway. But the economic argument is there's data everywhere that evidences this, and sometimes we need to make that argument to kind of really get in and get from 0 to 1. And yeah, and just to really spell that out down on the right there, sometimes we have to adjust the language that we speak into one of economics. Climate change is going to threaten our business's ability to stay alive, especially for a small business that doesn't have a hyper resilient supply chain. And transition planning helps us to not only survive but also to thrive in the long term. I'll pick up the pace slightly because I appreciate I've only got a few minutes. And I alluded to the evidence there. This is only a short session on a practical webinar, but you need to take my, don't take my word for it. There is a great wealth of evidence, and I've just picked out one quote from the research, or a quote associated with this research that the UK's Climate Change Committee put out. Nigel Topping as the new chair, which just I think encapsulates it really well. The evidence is really strong that we can do net zero, and it will be of significant benefit to the economy, both macroeconomically and microeconomically, both out there for the UK economy and the global economy, but also for smaller businesses as well. And I think that's a really important point to hammer home. It's aligning those two incentives together. And finally, I'll just touch on the kind of the sort of simplified framework, because again, going back to how we approach the advisory group to the updated Flex standard, so much of the work that we put into designing the Flex was about how we make this accessible and understandable to smaller businesses. And you've highlighted that in the responses to the poll. It's so often it's about knowing what to do and in what order. And so with the Flex, it was super important to us to kind of try and make sure that we were spelling everything out in the right way, in a way that you could understand and that we can all kind of leverage to make use of. And I think Demi's research shows that hopefully we did a relatively good job at that, and businesses are indeed using the Flex. I'm just going to flash up very quickly the way that we talk about it at Ecology, because it's a very, very similar school of thought. At Ecology, we try to distill climate leadership down into what we call the 3 R's: reduce, restore, report. And this is the idea that reduce is always the first step, and that's obviously what the Flex will tell you, it's what the SBTI will tell you, and everybody else. Reduction starts with measurement, setting targets, acting on those plans, designing your plan and acting on it. Restoration is the best practice in restoration is always evolving, and we think it's really important that businesses, insofar as they can, whilst they are doing their reduction in-house, work on everything down the supply chain and also outside the value chain as well. So contributing to projects that will move global net zero closer. And obviously reporting, transparent disclosures. And the way that I always talk about this as well is that the loud version of reporting is advocacy. It's about saying, here's what we've done, here's the progress that we have made, here's where we're struggling a little bit and what we're going to do about that, and here's what we think we need to see next. And so that is a cycle, and it's a cycle that any business can get on, and it always starts, and if I go to my final slide here, by making that case, as a business, we're going to make more money if we implement a credible net zero transition plan than if we don't. Supplemented, of course, by the fact that this is necessary, it is important, it is morally correct as well. But as a business, we will make more money if we implement a credible plan, and that credible plan starts with measuring our emissions. And that, I think, is the argument that I always encourage businesses, small businesses, to make. Say, look, this is going to help our business survive and thrive. And if we do that, then we're going to start here with measurement. And that's obviously what the Flex will tell you, and that's kind of the way that we approach things at Ecology as well. Okay, thank you very much. As I say, my name's Sam Jackson. Feel free to reach out to me. We'll do the Q&A a little bit later, but I believe I'm passing straight over to you, Mike.
Thank you, Sam. Hi, everyone. I'm Mike. I look after operations, partnerships, and sustainable growth at 5D. And I'm just going to run through a really light touch intro to practical resources, and a little bit on a practical approach of actually setting some targets, things to consider, and taking those first steps in picking a prioritization, because I think that's one of the hardest things for most SMEs, is being able to prioritize what to do first and when. But if you look at the next slide, I'm just going to refer back again to Demi's research, and just as a highlight, so I'm focusing on the second recommendation around helping actually getting started, and I've sort of cherry picked some of the examples that I think are the very best and easiest ways of starting and going through the process, and then going to do that sort of real life example. I've borrowed a client's prioritization board to help show how you can take those small steps and start building that momentum internally, which then feeds back into everything that Sam's just been talking about, which is proving concept and proving value, which is really important at the beginning, because then you can get momentum. Awesome. So if I just pop onto the next slide, just as a quick explanation of what I'm going to be running through. So in the first section, I just want to talk about the BSI Flex's actual process, and actually talk a little bit about how it matches with 5D and our sort of the way that we help organizations measure, plan and transform their business to find the value, create a bit of resilience, and sort of build that reputation for themselves. And then I'll talk around some key resources, whether the sort of key foundation standards that I really recommend, and where you can do some learning and upskilling on internally, some really accessible free tools, page support, I just want to mention quickly, where you want to go a step beyond, and then yeah, that implementation piece I'll cover. So we'll pop through, we can pop through this slide as well. I'm sure you've all, so we can go on to the actual flow. You may have already gone through the whole BSI Flex, but I just really wanted to talk about the individual stages, which is quite hard to actually see on this screen. I should have made bigger. but to a lot of the time and I've had this with clients who come to me after picking up the BSI Flex, is that it feels like it's a very big document and scary, but actually part of the reason why we think it had so much value when we were creating it is because we try to break down step by step, so you don't have to do a huge single piece. It's around those small steps that actually follow through and mean that you can plan and transition effectively. Just if you on the next slide, I'll jump through these quite quickly so we can go into a bit more detail. I've sort of grouped them alongside sort of our theory of change, so our change management system, which is around, as Sam's highlighted, around building that business case. Getting that top management commitment is sometimes can feel like the biggest hurdle, particularly if you don't have external pressures from procurement, etc. However, it's so important to have those points to talk to your stakeholders, to get the things that they care about and their sort of drivers, as well as the sort of critical sort of value and doing the right thing, because that will help you with making change at a later date. So if you know that someone's particularly passionate about a specific area around energy or around social value, that can help you at a later date when you're implementing and sort of aligning your business goals with making sure your business is ready for the future. It's also talking to your staff and getting buy-in and sometimes skills base right at the beginning, understanding who's interested, who's invested, and who might already have some foundational knowledge or willing to learn. And once you've sort of scoped out the internal buy-in, you can then start looking at what you're going to report, what you're not. If you're not going to report on something, why? And go through and start decoding what your activities day to day actually mean in emissions. And this is one of those things that it feels like it is often the biggest piece of work where everyone's got momentum, and then once you've got it, it then is hard to go to the next steps. So we'll talk about that in a bit. But it's actually one of the bits that it's the point at which you're being informed about the decisions you're going to take. Just as you might go to your accountant when you're looking at doing looking at a loan to do an investment internally, it's the same approach. You want as good a data as possible so that you can make as informed decisions as possible. Then you go into designing your plan, your transition plan or carbon reduction plan. That's establishing those targets, is around developing the actual actions that you're going to do to reach those targets. And then it goes into the actual delivery phase and then repeat. And obviously, for some organizations, you have external requirements. That might be legislative. You might be meeting compliance. You might be going towards tenders, PPNs for the Procurement Act. And that might be that you want to externally report or externally commit, which I'll also talk about in a second. So then there's one final thing, but we don't need to move back slides. But with the BSI Flex, it is a Bible almost of the process and additional frameworks that you can use, and different standards you can use. I've really cherry picked some essentials that I think are essentials in terms of standards on the next slide, and then I've also gone into sort of the top free resources and accessible resources. You may be very, very familiar with these three, but I really think these three are the key sort of standards and frameworks that an SME can lean on, particularly as they are internationally recognized, and are really so they sort of are relatively accessible and are also the foundations for most of the resources I'm going to be talking about. To navigate all these different stages that I talked about above, these are really good foundations, particularly the GHG protocol, which is the most widely used standard for corporate measuring and reporting, for carbon accounting. It has so many guides. It has some free courses that you can just do online, that you can sort of self-do and give that real initial sort of understanding. I find it very, very useful as a base knowledge, but also as a sense check when you're building those sort of that initial boundary around what you're going to report and what not, and the reasoning about why is really, really helpful. It's also has further learning resources that are paid that can really take you to the next steps if you want to upskill in-house. But the free guides and courses they do have are really, really good. They also have a lovely database of additional tools for sector specific and for databases around conversion rates, etc., which I'll talk about in a bit. ISO 14064 -1. You've probably seen this, particularly our consultants. We love to talk about ISO. It's a much more formal way of reporting, and it can be audited. It has a pathways of being audited and verified independently, etc. The good news is that actually the GHG protocol and ISO have announced that they're going to be collaborating and aligning these standards around sort of giving you that sort of a much more aligned, so it gives you more accessibility from the GHG protocol angle and much more sort of formal recognition through the ISO. I'm not sure the timeframes on that, but those two at the moment are really good. ISO 14064 you do have to pay for. It's not a free online thing. However, everything in the BSI Flex is aligned to it, and the resources I'm going to talk about in a bit are also, particularly the one that's my favorite, I'm going to be waffling on about even more, is also aligned. You've also probably heard of SBTI. Again, the disclosure process, there are other ones available, the CDP, etc. But the actual framework behind it means that if you're setting targets and you align to it, you are setting your business up to be aligned to that Paris Agreement, to aiming to reduce to keep it to 1.5 increase in temperature. And you don't need to go down the paid route. You don't need to disclose through them to use their framework. And it's again a really good sense check. And they also have additional webinars, learning tools, etc. So for the free resources, I am going to premise this by I have a very clear favorite, which is the SME Climate Hub Calculator. As a consultancy, we often have, particularly the smaller SMEs, smaller enterprises coming to us with really small budgets that want to get started, and we often refer them to the SME Climate Hub as a free, really good tool that doesn't just have the tool but also has case studies as examples, has additional resources, but it's a fantastic way of getting started and a way for you to test and play and learn in your own way. So I want to go through the sort of core stages and refer to a few. I've created an additional page, which we'll talk about in a second, or you'll see it in a second as we pass through it, but that has all the links to, so when you get these slides later, you should be able to go to each one of these and explore it more. But for measurements, the SME Climate Hub Calculator has the two options. So all of the images on your left-hand side show you the sort of an examples of what that might look like. It's for small businesses up to 50 people, and then has an option for more for slightly larger ones, slightly larger organizations. But it will go step by step and sort of handhold you through, which I think it was over 50% of people talked about knowledge being a real challenge in the first poll, and this enables you to get started and start learning as you do in a free and accessible way. There are other options available. The Carbon Trust Calculator has a really nice top level free calculator, and that sort of feeds into their wider services. The NatWest's carbon planner has got better and better in recent years, and again automates some of the suggestions later down the line, same as the SME Climate Hub. So that once you're starting to look at potential actions you can take, it's already starting to give you a bit of a brainstorm. They are not bespoke. It's not going to be 100% right for your business, but it'll start giving you the foundations of what that might look like. And you can also do all of this yourself. So the larger, the sort of advanced business carbon calculator is a good template from the SME Climate Hub. But you can use the UK government conversion rates. They're publicly available and free, and it can feel overwhelming at first, but once you start getting your head around it, there are again guidances on the SME Climate Hub around how to, and the UK Business Climate Hub, how to utilize those. So as I've talked about the SME Climate Hub and NatWest, they already automate a lot of this, so they give you guidance around the target setting. The SME Climate Hub is really aligned to SBTI, and the SBTI's bespoke SME target setting, and will really help you do the sort of the minimal to meet those, and it will sort of automate that for you as you go through. I will also recommend going if there are certain sectors where the SBTI SME target guidance, the corporate guidance, isn't a problem for. So if you're in oil and gas, etc., or you're in agriculture, you might want to look at sector-specific target setting, and that there's some really good tools on SBTI on how to use those. Yes, the same with the pathways and actions. They give you examples. Adam at the Small 99 do fantastic workshops, but they also have a free resource which you can self-use yourself, and can start building up again those ideas of actions. But what I'll be talking about in a bit is that it's really important for you to do what's right for your business at this time, and being realistic about that, and sometimes picking maybe prioritizing which ones to do, which actions to do, rather than feeling like you need to do everything today, because that can then start challenging the sort of first stage, which is that commitment from leaders, particularly if there's financial resources or time resources that haven't proven concept yet. And then in terms of reporting, there's a free disclosure process on the SME Climate Hub. Again, another reason why I'm a big fan. But also it really helps set you up so that you can report. If you are going to things like tenders, you can report to things like the PPN 006. You might have known it before. Previously, it was 06/21, which is just a reporting framework for procurement for SME for local authorities that's starting to filter through. So I really recommend checking all of those out. And I also just wanted to give a final thing around further support. So there is a place for paid support. I always talk about our services a little bit like an accountant, where you might even get to the point that you're doing it yourself, but you might want some sense check from someone who does it day to day, as their day job, and can give you that sort of key guidance to help you get the most out of this process. However, that isn't right for every business, and then within that there's sort of two broad churches, which is nicely represented by me and Sam on the call. So there's more of an integrated technological solution, like ecology, and then there's more sort of bespoke for whether that's because you want more hands-on and doesn't necessarily need tech, or if that's because you've got a particularly complex business structure. Both have real value, and if it's right for your business, you can often, if you're smaller, start small and scale up with that support, depending as and when you need it. So the next slide is just a quick resource links so that you can find it later. I'm aware of time, so I'm going to scoot on into actually this third section, which is just as a reminder about how do you actually set targets? how do you actually prioritize initiatives? I've tried to give a bit of an example from a client around how we did this, and then actually how you then take those steps forward. So first, setting your targets. On the next slide, you can see, so when you're thinking about SBTI, a lot of the tools and resources I talked about, when they're looking at setting targets, they'll only really be looking at near term and long term as big set in the stone milestones. Long term, that's for most sectors, that's doing reducing by, or for SMEs, at least 90% from your baseline by 2025. That would be your target, but that really depends on your sector. So if you're a supplier to the NHS, there might be an increased demand for you to be more 2040 or 2045 to have that long-term target. So always check your sector relevance, because there will be guidance on that. Near term, so this traditionally a lot of people have preferred 2030 as a near term. That's tied to the sort of expectations that people would have a baseline from around 2020, but really it's any time 5 to 10 years ahead of time. What does it look like in terms of your reductions? This tends to be absolute reductions in your scope 1 and 2, so things like your vehicles, company-owned vehicles, the gas burn on site, electricity you're purchasing, reducing emissions relevant to those, absolutely 0, and then having a separate reduction target, scope 3, and that's around trying to reduce as much as you can. For some sectors, that's looking at a 50% reduction across the board by the odd 5 to 10. Again, the thing I'd say for both near and long is there was a flurry initially around people setting really ambitious targets, which is awesome. Love the enthusiasm, but then the realization that change can be hard, particularly the bigger stuff, and when the wider economy and political environment changes unexpectedly and makes more challenges. So it's about being realistic. There's nothing wrong with setting a 2050 long-term target if that suits your sector and your business, and then actually achieving it earlier. You can have stretch targets, but it's around being realistic to yourselves. The near term really helps you then have a medium-term milestone to make sure you get there. But then I really like short term. So short term is aligned to your business cycle, aligned to your business plan. Ideally, it's annually, but this is actually setting out some real smart goals, so that you know that it's specific, you know that it's measured. I've suddenly had a blank on the A, which is embarrassing. Accurate, I think, and then relatable and timely. And it's around making it so that you know that you have a little KPI or a little measurement to go like, I know I'm going to do this initiative by this time in the next year or 2 years, and this is the outcome. So once you've set these targets, you then need to look at actually how do you get there. And I just wanted to do on the next slide, just share a little bit of how we recommend thinking about this from 5D's perspective. We normally talk about 3 types of initiatives that we recommend. So often in your journey, while it's ideal to record everything, all of scope 3 and all as detailed as possible, that can be a really big step for a lot of the SMEs. And some SMEs want to start with more spend data, so more broad data, and maybe not reporting everything and everything. That's not a recommendation, but it's just that's the reality. So if that's what you need to do, maybe it's that you are aligning to that PPN and you can only do those core scope 3s within your time, cost, and expertise. Then it might be that in the next year you need to look at how to improve that data. That might be energy and implementing something so that you're not going to go and check a meter every time. You've got something that automatically reports it. It might be that you have tracking on your vehicles. It might be that you look at your top 5 expenditures in your purchase goods, and you actually work with your supply chain to capture what the real emissions are. Then you have hard initiatives. So this is like the example. So it's the physical changes that you're going to do, whether that's installing solar, whether that is doing those, implementing those smart meters, whether that is actually investing in a different product to so that has lower emissions. And the final one is soft initiatives. This is the fluffy one that can be harder to actually see the clear result, but that can be something around comms, around where people are putting waste. If you've done a track on your waste and realize that not many people are recycling, that might be something that you might do, or promoting cycling or public transport, for example. I'm really aware of time and that I'm being late, so I'll move on to the next slide. Once you've understood those three types, the thing that I often see people fail at is that they try and do everything at once, and they try to overachieve, particularly in the first few years. And while we should be trying to reduce as fast as possible, it's around prioritizing. For SMEs, you don't have all day, all week to be driving these initiatives. So it's around picking ones that are really aligned to your business goals, particularly if they are quick wins that are short term, as in like you can get a return on your investment soon. Or if you identify that they're bigger projects that might not be today, is understanding if they have a high enough impact to then start working on today to achieve in 5-10 years time. I find this matrix really, really helpful with my clients to start filtering out what they should be focusing on year, and what they need to plan for and develop in that longer term projects, so that they can then pick 5, 3, 7 things that they will achieve within the next year, within the next 3 years. And an example of that, I wanted to give a quick example of one that we did in a workshop with a client. Is we mapped out, I haven't shown all the different ones, but I've tried to pick some key ones, because these really change for your business. So some people, it might be that the same initiative is more effort. So when I say effort, that's time, money, knowledge in-house resource, get it, like the barrier, there might be higher barriers to getting it done. And that, so some initiatives might vary between business to business. However, once you start mapping it, you can start picking the quick wins that you can do within the next year. And these new ones might occur each year. And then major projects are longer term ones that you can focus on. And it might start being that I normally have the line of, in the first few years, if they are above that dotted line, then maybe that's not something that you need to focus on today. You have limited resources, so focus on the things that have the highest impact, and ideally not the biggest barriers, so that you can then build that business case and get that return as well. Cool. If people want to have more conversations around that implementation, please ask us in the panel section. I ran through that bit because I'm a bit over time, but for the next section, we're just going to ask you another question, this time around actually what's stopping you. So the first question was around what the challenges you were having to get started. This is more around what the barriers your organizations are facing to actually implement those net zero actions. So I'm just going to go off screen and then we can do the poll. I know a few people are still answering, but I just thought I would jump in and just give a bit of reflection. It's again a relative spread, but a thing that's a clear thing that has come out is around internal resources, whether that's funding to actually invest in those bigger projects, or I imagine just you have so much to do day to day that is challenging. And then also there's the link again, the rest are a bit of a spread again, time. A fair number of you have gone for, and just knowledge and expertise. One of the big things I always say around knowledge and expertise, I just want to start with that one, is a lot of this is a lot easier than it feels. So it's not necessarily about you being the expert in energy efficiencies. It's around finding either the resources that are available or a partner who does. So for example, with energy, there's the Energy Savings Trust, has loads and loads. I should have added that on as a resource. I'll add it onto the slides after. But there's a really good example of initiatives that can save money, quick wins, and is a sort of like step-by-step process on how to do things, and then refers you to other experts if you need. It's the internal resource is probably why Sam and I exist. Sometimes once you get started, doing the next steps can be the really biggest challenge. That's why it's really good to, if you prioritize your actions, and if you're finding you're not able to, if you've reported for a couple of years and you're not seeing the change that you'd like to because things aren't being completed, it's better to reduce the goals that you want to do and then prioritize those and getting them done. Normally, if you have a year, you'll wait until the last few months, remember that you need to do it. So it's good to give it as a project management bit. Also, once you've done those small wins, that starts building the case more to have more investment internally because you've seen the return on investment. But I'm sure we'll have a panel on that in a second, and I imagine Sam will also have his point of view on this.
Great. If I can invite you all to turn your cameras on, all in the webinar, that is, rather than all of our audience. Thank you very much for that. That was really insightful, and I hope a really helpful and quite in-depth way of looking at both the how you talk to the issue of how you make that case for you in your organization and why it's important to do this, and also the things that can help you, the way you need to prioritize and think about it in order to get it done in the right ways, given things like lack of resource and time. I thought the questions the polls were interesting. I think they reflected quite a lot of what we'd sort of heard from people in the impact assessment as well, which was interesting too. I had a couple of questions came through whilst you were both speaking, Mike and Sam, but and we had some questions prior to the webinar, so people who signed up asked some questions that they wanted you to reflect on, if possible. So, I mean, there was one question just that came in, which is a sort of a broad-based question about the whole idea of being a small, medium-sized enterprise in this environment. And that question was, what does this all mean for small business, and what can they expect looking forward? What sorts of changes are likely to happen in the near future? What's your reflections on that particular sort of very broad area, Sam and Mike?
Perhaps I'll start with this one, Mike, because I think it goes back to some of the stuff that I put in my presentation. The starting with why. Why is this going to impact me, and what should I expect? It's a question. It's really broad. It's really, really broad. I think half of the challenge to getting started is trying to appreciate the scale and the gravity of the information that is out there about what the implications are for a business, and distill that into something that you as a sustainability professional or as a business leader can firstly understand, but then enunciate. You know, it's easy for me to say this will affect your supply chain, for example, but it's slightly more difficult to interpret that as, okay, well, what if I've got this particular material that I need to get from here to here, and actually that's going to be disrupted by, or potential for landslides that are increasing in that particular part of the world, or you know, really material, specific things. I think one thing that's worth thinking about and focusing on, because I know both of us actually touched on this a little bit, was the kind of best practice and regulatory landscape, because for small businesses, because the status quo at the moment, at the very least in sustainability reporting and disclosures and transition plans, is that the vast majority of obligations sits with listed businesses over a certain size, certain turnover. And that will remain the case. You know, small businesses, there's only so much that any small business can do. But I think it's true that the requirement for small businesses to adhere to increasing standards of best practice, certainly as regards disclosures, and subsequently as regards concrete feasible transition plans and evidencing progress against those transition plans, is going to increase. And I think that's almost one of the ways in which the business, any small business, regardless of what it is that you actually do, that's kind of a more ubiquitous thing I think we should be expecting in the not distant future, you know, the next year, 2-3 years. I think, Mike, you touched a little bit on the kind of convergence of the greenhouse gas protocol and the ISO standards, for example. That's a really good thing, I think. I think harmonizing standards has been something that I'm sure you and I have been calling for years, because the amount of standards that exist out there is part of the reason why we need to do the flex in the first place, right? So that you can make sense of it. And so I think, you know, what do we need to think about? What do we need to expect? Whilst it's a really broad question, I think I would hone in on those two aspects. You know, try and translate the generalized abstract concepts like this will affect our supply chain into, well, what might that mean for us? And then be really, really conscious of the obligations under regulation and best practice that are coming down the pipeline as well. So I pick out those two. I don't know, Michael, whether you feel different, but that's kind of how I would at least start answering that question.
Yeah, I think it's spot on. I was just trying to articulate, but I think you articulated it better than I could. The two, like, so you got the legislation, and then the two bits are basically everyone's costs are going to be more and more challenging, and then we're going to be operating in more and more uncertainty. Even though the legislation, like sounds like, aren't necessarily applying directly to most SMEs, there is starting to be for me, frustrating trend of larger businesses pushing their problem onto their supply chain. So even while you might not, once they come in, like the sustainability reporting standards might not affect you in the first instance, you might see, we're already seeing with EcoVadis, right? So big businesses are going through EcoVadis and then pushing onto their supply chain to report on a plethora of things, including carbon, and which is just an additional cost for your running, particularly if they want to see multiple years improvement when you haven't. And so on the flip side, what we hope with the flex is giving that single point where you can start actually highlighting the value that you have, because it will start being so like the Procurement Act in the beginning of the year, in February when it came out, they've changed the wording slightly, and so that it's cost and it's around and social value and your emissions. So it's not just something that people can forget in the same way. So there's the slow change, but I think the building up, highlighting your value that you bring, and minimizing risk, right? We are so SMEs are probably more vulnerable to this uncertainty than these large businesses. So if we can map out those risks and minimize them, and communicate that you aren't a risk, that you are reliable, and build that reputation, then that will help you with your resilience with that uncertainty.
And if just to add another crystalline example, which I think I've sort of touched on, and I think you went into some specifics on, Mike, with the public procurement notice, the PPN 006, which used to be 0621. There was a consultation for that I responded to on Ecology's behalf last week from the NHS England about the plans that they have to turn the screw slightly on that one. So the obligation at the moment is, disclosure of scope 1 and 2 and 5 categories of scope 3. And the way that NHS England think about this, and this is a trend, just an example, but a trend that we see a lot in the consultations that we respond to in the interface with government that we have, they're saying to us, even in industry, we're thinking about obligating suppliers to NHS to do not just 5 categories of scope 3, but all of them. And if they can't do all of them, then they need to explain why, kind of comply or explain model. And typically policy and regulation and law is a lag indicator, right? It's the slowest thing that can happen. And so if we're seeing that coming from there, just using the specific example of PPN 006, what does that mean for your business? What do you need to expect? Well, are you supplying government with anything? Are you selling something to a government department? Because if so, there's something that's very clear, and albeit the rules and regs for on a broader scale might not be applicable to you because you're not listed, you're not a large corporation. That's a very tangible way that you will win or lose money on the basis of your compliance with a certain standard. And again, it's kind of it's the way the wind is blowing, I think, and that's the sort of thing that I think small businesses need to be aware of as well.
Thanks very much. That's a very comprehensive response to a very broad question. Thank you. But we've had questions sort of reflecting on everything that you were saying. Somebody has just asked that we're a startup and want to build carbon emissions in right from the beginning. And one of the biggest obstacles for us is getting information out of our supply chain. And we've met some real resistance to getting suppliers to come on board. What would you advise? What would you suggest in that case?
So this is something that I think every single one of my clients, without an exception, purchase goods and services is like the hardest, that our own supply chains are a challenge. You have 3 ways that I've seen progress happen. One is using a proxy certification to actually just move and change suppliers if you can. That doesn't work with some. It's very different if you're looking at a broad scope. If you're getting cleaners into an office, that might be a lot easier to change than if you have a widget that you're developing that can only be reproduced in the widget factory in this one place. So there's flexibility. Then there's getting partnership funds to actually work with them if they're one of a key change, like a key area, to then help them along their journey, which is again a big ask for a startup, but it might be part of your business model. And then the third way is actually I've seen some change where competitors have actually collaborated when they've had joint suppliers. So there's areas that across an industry they're supplying to something, and they use that as a platform to try and influence. And maybe as a startup organization, that could be an interesting angle for you. It really depends on the supply chain, but for me that would probably be if it's not something that you can switch and they're not wanting to change or internalize it themselves, and they don't want to do any action themselves, and it's not about cost, it's about they just don't want to do it, then it's trying to find a group to sort of almost act as a union to influence change. I don't know if Sam's got any additional.
No, I would echo that entirely. I mean, I might feel more qualified to talk about the more specific practical things, but I mean, I would start in the same way that you did, which is to say that you are not alone in this. Every business everywhere that we talk to has this exact challenge, because, you know, and it's one of the reasons why the Flex and indeed all the other standards that exist out there start with understanding boundaries, because it's like, what can you actually control? Where can you exercise direct control in terms of the electricity that you use, the fuel that you burn? And then where can you influence indirect control? And there's some interesting kind of, as a side note, but there's some interesting research that's been done by the team at Oxford Net Zero on this, about, you know, where your spheres of influence are as a business and how you can leverage them. I think the example of pooling together, I think, is a really interesting one. It's only been more maybe the past year or so that I've seen that. I'm sure it was going on before that, but just this idea that as an industry group or a group of similar businesses, especially smaller businesses or businesses that might be very different but just happen to have the same element of their supply chain, same material supplier, same whatever, kind of coming together. And firstly, I think you alluded to, you know, you might have more direct influence over a piece of decarbonization, you know, decarbonization opportunity if you do that together. But also it's economies of scale, you know, and I'm going to keep hammering this point about economics, because in my experience, it's a really frustrating wall to bump up against. Is yes, but this costs more money. Well, if we can kind of come together and identify where we've got crossover in our supply chains and kind of try and pool resources, pool data, pool resources, pool relationships, then it will make it cheaper for everyone anyway, because of economies of scale. And so I think, yeah, I mean, I'm only putting a sharper point on the point you've already made. I completely agree with you. I think that's a really compelling opportunity, but I would always start off by saying, you know, this is not a novel problem. I think I love speaking to startups who have that mindset of, I want to do this right from the beginning. But this was always going to be one of the big challenges, and you're not alone in experiencing it.
Do you think there's also the point around prioritizing? So it's like there is a tendency, particularly, like there are things that's why I like that sort of 3-level approach of targets. There's also that 3 levels. There are some things that are so I have a client who has Arctic trucks, and they are not going to be able to, it doesn't work in their business model as it is today, and they don't want to change the business model to transition to the electric Arctic trucks. They don't have the mileage and they aren't tested, and there's a whole lot of other bits, but that is a problem for them. That is a sticking point. So that is being delayed. That's a 2035, hopefully before, but 2035 problem. And so, and it's we want to see as much change as possible, but we can't change everything at once. So particularly as a startup, you've got some really key things about route to market. So it's about embedding your reporting so that you don't have to think about it, super easy. And so then it's not an additional thing, it's just tying your goals to your business goals, and then identifying the things that you do have that direct control over, just as Sam was talking about, that sort of sphere of influence.
Absolutely. And I think as almost a sort of an adjunct to that question, and sort of a similar point really, was a question that we had on about the lack of maybe staff buy-in to initiatives and the difficulty of getting staff to enter into good practices and report data and what you should do in order to to bring your people along with you internally. It may be the same kind of answer, but I
always just say, so businesses are just people, right? Like we're all just, and we all have our interests and passions and things that we care about. Most people don't go around being like, I want to make the world worse. It's normally like they're focusing on their day-to-day life and they have something that they care about, whether that's sport, whether that's litter picking, whether that's making sure that nurseries are actually stocked properly. So finding those things that your staff care about is one thing. Sharing education in a way that actually resonates with them is another. And then linking that to how that can better their own jobs and their own lives, and hopefully a shared vision. But there are some wider challenges on company culture. I think those two, understand your people, and then sharing information. I think hands down every single time has been a win for me for businesses we've worked with. It's slow. It's not an overnight thing. But
yes, I can see. Sorry, Sam, did you want to come in there?
Well, I mean, firstly, beautifully put. I think I'd agree completely. The only other thing I'd add to that is so much of the implementation component of this is things that makes a business, more centralized, more efficient in lots of ways. A classic example is always, the ops team. If your small business is big enough to have, in distinct teams, which are often obviously very small businesses don't, but if the ops team wants to have a booking system for hotels or travel or something like that, your sustainability guys are going to want to go, well, is it a platform that can help us calculate the emissions and do the reporting and pull out the data that we need to work out what business travel we're doing? If those are two conversations that are happening separately, then they're never going to get along, because the operations person is going to have a certain set of priorities. The sustainability person is going to have a different set of priorities, and it's going to cause both of these personas twice as much work. Whereas if we can come together, and as Mike says, if we can find ways that in doing what we need to do for sustainability purposes will make your job easier, it's win-win for everybody. And so, yeah, I mean, I could not agree more with the kind of slightly more personal, psychological side of it. But again, it's kind of on a practical level. I think it's finding those commonalities and efficiencies across teams that are going to help build stuff together, rather than building it over here and thrusting it upon everybody else over there, for sure.
Great, thanks very much. I've got a question that about regulations that are coming down the line that you spoke about. What sort of effect do you think this is likely to have, and are they likely to be designed to be complied with financial penalties of some sort if they're not achievable? This is from somebody in the transport network thinking about fleet replacement not being achievable as technology isn't there, which I think is something you reflected on there, Mike, earlier about the different electric vehicle issue.
Sam will probably have a more on the pulse of this than me.
About the regulatory.
The regulation at the moment, from our point of view, has a lot of noise, but not defined milestones of what that looks like. And it also depends on the what area of the regulation. So things like energy might, there might be a point around offsets, but that seems to have gone quiet again. So from our point of view, not really in the next 5 years. But again, Sam will probably have a more for SMEs. Sorry, specifically for SMEs, but yeah.
Yeah, I think that's fair, Mike. And I think to caveat, transport sector is not a particular area of specialism for me. So I'm speaking more generally. When the Labour government came in a year ago, they sort of went consultation mad. There's consultations everywhere about ESG reporting standards and disclosure standards and things like that. And broadly speaking, the trends that I'm seeing are coalescence of standards that are already there. So industry's got things like the Science Based Targets Initiative and ISO and Greenhouse Gas Protocol and all the rest. In addition, on the other end, of the journey, there's in carbon, there's the ICVCM, there's the VCMI now, and it's just a load of acronyms that I'm throwing out. But the point is that there's stuff in industry that government is actually quite actively listening to, which I think is a relief. So I would agree with Mike, certainly for smaller businesses, I don't think you're likely anytime in the immediate future to be financially penalized for not replacing a vehicle fleet, because government does understand, I believe, from my experience with them, that they do understand that this is a lot harder when you've got fewer resources, especially in a specialist industry where the tech just literally isn't there yet at an affordable level. So that on the one hand, it's something you absolutely must keep an eye on. On the other hand, I wouldn't be worried about somebody coming to knock the door down tomorrow. And what I'd also just signpost as well is, because of the coalescence of industry and government standards, and because there's this huge interest in consulting with industry and with civil society, I would almost use industry standards as the lead indicator for regulation, which is the lag indicator. So when we're currently anticipating obviously convergence between the greenhouse gas protocol and the ISO, which I think is a really good thing. But we're also anticipating the update to the corporate standard from the Science Based Target Initiative towards the end of this year. I would be really interested, even if some of these rules and regs don't apply to you specifically in your business case, I'd be really interested to see what approach those are taking when they are published, because I think it's extremely likely that as the regulation comes down through the economy and broadens through the economy, it's going to closely match what we're seeing from some of these standards that come out a little bit sooner that don't necessarily apply to you directly. So yeah, I don't think you need to panic today, as Mike says, but it's certainly something that you can get a grip on before these kind of rules and regs come down through the pipe.
Yes, and I think just to add in there quickly on the basis of what we do in standards. Standards, of course, are not regulation, but they try really hard to align with those things which people are going to be facing in their business, in their organization, so that they can, so that it's not, you're not going to be doing anything in contradiction to what you need to be ultimately complying with and your obligations in the future, if you're using standards. So that should be helpful to you. So the other thing that it's sort of again, it's a question that maybe it sort of is similar to that last one about regulation, in that it's another question that comes up a lot, and maybe we've got a couple of moments to just answer it in the last few minutes. But it was, if SMEs are taking all their own measurements and reporting publicly, in other words, if the regulation comes in to make them to do so, maybe, are they going to be at risk of allegations of greenwashing if they don't have some sort of independent verification of the measurements that they're taking? Quickly answer and then I'll get you to
no.
wrap.
As long as you've got the data, get your data, and then any statement you make sure that it's honest to that data, then you're not greenwashing. I mean, they'll get, if you get it verified, if you go through that, then there's more rigor to it, and you can blame someone else if there's some, but as long as you're not trying to inflate or twist data, and you just state as it is, yeah. I think greenwash has become such a scary thing, right? But
yeah,
as long as you're not as long as you're not trying to market it out in a way, you're not inflating anything.
All the wool over anyone's eye. Yeah.
I don't know how Sam feels. Maybe I'm
no, I agree, Mike. Believe it or not, there's a consultation about this as well. Yeah, firstly, I agree with you. Small businesses, there is a lot of understanding, I think, that the obligations on much larger businesses will never be the same as the obligations on small businesses. That's not a thing. But I think you're right. I think the fear of being called out for greenwashing is something that really, really hampers action. And there's a consultation again that we responded to recently where I said exactly that, and in our response to it, which was, there's a growing interest in requiring assurance, sustainability reporting assurance on reporting for larger businesses, tuning up the assurance requirement from limited to reasonable and so on and so forth. Should we obligate smaller businesses to have limited? And again, it's sort of like, well, sure, that has to come down maybe in the longer term, but really we're still in a phase getting everybody from 0 to 1, aren't we? And so, yeah, no, I don't see it as realistic that you're going to get penalized. And if you're honest, and if you're, as you say, not twisting data or making claims that you know to be false, then I think you're probably going to be fine.
Thank you. And thank you all for your input into this very insightful session. And really appreciate your your professional kind of perceptions of how this works and how the Flex can really help people frame their step-by-step approaches. I would ask you for one more sort of final wrap up before we, one final thought in that, but my thanks are there, but one final thought over to you both. or even Demi, all of you, in fact.
So I mine not be as insightful as the others, so I can go first. But I think from the research that I did, it would be get started with what you can. So I think that'd be my final thought is, yeah, get started.
It's a really great.
Yeah, and I guess to follow the order that we spoke in as well, go springboarding off Demi, you know, in order to get started, start with why. Why is this going to impact our business? Why is this something that we must do? And why is it going to help us survive and thrive if we do it?
And then probably just to build on that is pick the things that you know will save you money, increase value, all of those sort of quick wins that you then can prove concept to keep that momentum going. Trying to not keep walking. Yeah.
Thank you all very much. I hope everyone found that useful. As I said before, you'll be able to watch this webinar again and hear anything that you felt that you missed in a bit more detail. There's the slides will be available and information about things that were mentioned, resources, standards that were mentioned today, and of course I commend you to the Flex itself and the Net Zero Standards Hub and the guides and the case studies that go alongside the Flex that you might find also very useful to follow as models. Anyway, thank you again. There are, please do register for any of our other webinars during this Net Zero week. These are the ones that we have left, just on the screen there for you. And there will be a link that you can in the chat, I think, that has been supplied by our team, so that you can link in and sign up to any of those if you're interested. I won't read them out for you, but they're all very, very interesting. And the ones earlier in the week, of course, will also be available on catch up or on recorded for you to listen to again. So thank you very much for your attention. And with that, I'd like to wish you all a very nice day.